That was the summer I decided to take a vacation, to leave Berlin and escape those streets and the overwhelming routine that, over the years, had become unbearable. My name is Sebastian, and with the hope of finding a change in my life, I set off for a destination that promised calm and rest. A small village nestled in the Bavarian countryside, called Kleinwald, about 2 hours by train from the capital. I never imagined that this trip would make me a witness to human cruelty in the hotel of that remote place. I remember how the train moved away from the city, leaving behind the gray buildings and crowded avenues, to immerse myself in a landscape of rolling hills, dense forests, and fields bathed in the summer sun. The atmosphere became almost unreal, as if nature wanted to envelop me in its own secret. As the train advanced, the murmur of metal on the tracks mixed with the distant song of birds, creating an eerily serene soundtrack. Upon arriving in Kleinwald, my eyes met a village that seemed frozen in time. The cobblestone streets and the facades of the houses, adorned with vines and withered flowers, gave the impression that life there moved at a very different pace than in the modern world. However, there was something in the air, an almost imperceptible whisper, that made me feel I was not alone in that peaceful place. The hotel, the Oak Inn, stood in the center of the village, surrounded by a small neglected garden and ancient trees whose gnarled arms seemed to hide forgotten secrets. Its architecture, halfway to decay, evoked both a past of glory and decadence. Crossing the main door, the fragrance of old wood and a slight smell of dampness enveloped me. The lobby, illuminated by a dim light that filtered through thick curtains, revealed framed portraits of figures from times past, whose eyes seemed to follow every step I took. I sat in one of the worn armchairs in the reception area, hoping that a little rest would erase the fatigue of the journey. While waiting to check in, the murmur of muffled conversations mixed with the creaking of the wooden floor. In a corner, an elderly hotel clerk watched me with an enigmatic gaze, as if he wanted to warn me of something without uttering a word. The decor, though sober, was imbued with a dense and almost oppressive atmosphere, which contrasted sharply with the bucolic image suggested by the exterior. During those first moments at the Oak Inn, I was invaded by a feeling of unease that was hard to decipher. Perhaps it was the solitude, or the echo of distant footsteps in the empty hallways, or maybe it was the memory of the place, which seemed to hold stories of pain and suffering. However, at that moment, the only thing I could think about was that my escape from Berlin had led me to a place where calm intertwined with shadows, a prelude to a night that would change my perception of reality. That first night, as I settled into an austere room decorated with old oak furniture, the wind whistled through the cracks in the windows, and in the silence, I could hear what seemed to be murmurs of unknown voices. Unknowingly, I had just opened the door to a mystery that would delve into the darkest aspects of human nature, marking the beginning of a terrifying experience that I would never forget. Those days in Kleinwald were liberating. During the first few days, I went out to explore the village, discovering its cobblestone streets and chatting with its people. The atmosphere, definitely different from that of Berlin, enveloped me with an air of mystery and calm that seemed to whisper forgotten secrets. The friendly faces of the locals and their tales of ancient legends made me feel part of a scene taken from another time. Each morning I woke up with the promise of adventures, walks through the nearby forests, visits to small squares adorned with fountains, and impromptu chats in the village cafes. Life seemed to flow with the slowness and charm typical of the Bavarian countryside, and little by little, I began to forget the heavy routine of the big city. However, there was one detail that I couldn't overlook: the persistent noise coming from the room above in the hotel. Every night, almost like a ritual, a dry and resonant thud could be heard, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the dark hallways of the Oak Inn. It was as if someone was hammering in the distance, blow after blow, in a rhythmic pattern that repeated without fail. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought maybe they were doing repairs or maintenance work. After all, the noise wasn't so annoying as to warrant a formal complaint. It was just a couple of occasional thuds, but their unavoidable presence unsettled me in an inexplicable way. While exploring the village during the day, my mind was distracted by the beauty and simplicity of the surroundings. I talked with the neighbors in the square, where an old man told me stories of times when the village was celebrated with parties in the central square, and a woman offered me tea in her small antique shop, recounting legends about a spirit that roamed the nearby forest. But at nightfall, upon returning to the hotel, the calm was broken by those thuds. Every time the sound began, I felt a pang of unease, as if the echo of that thud announced something more than mere repairs. I tried to convince myself that it was just renovation work or the normal creaking of an old building. However, the way the thud resonated in the dim light, almost ceremonially, awakened in me a feeling of foreboding. Sometimes I stayed awake in my room, staring at the ceiling in silence, waiting for the next thud to reveal some explanation, or at least, confirm that there was nothing sinister behind it. One night, after one of those thuds, I decided to discreetly go down to the reception to casually ask if there were repairs being done in the room above. The elderly clerk, with his enigmatic gaze and a barely perceptible smile, simply said, "Sometimes, in places like this, the sound is more than the echo of a hammer." That answer left me frozen, but I didn't want to press further. Perhaps it was just the imagination of a foreigner trying to rationalize the inexplicable. Still, as I continued my walks through Kleinwald, the image of that hotel, with its secrets and its nocturnal echoes, became more entrenched in my mind. Each thud was a subtle reminder that, beneath the appearance of a peaceful and charming place, there were mysteries that defied understanding and suggested the presence of something much darker. Those nights became a silent game between my curiosity and my fear. The echo of that thud continued to mark the rhythm of my stay, and each day, upon returning to my room, I wondered if I would discover the true origin of that sound that seemed to announce the beginning of something inevitable. Meanwhile, the promise of new discoveries during the day mixed with the growing unease of the night, weaving within me a tangle of emotions that made me doubt whether it was, in reality, just the creaking of an old structure or the prelude to an even darker story. The last night at the Oak Inn was a disconcerting mix of silence and foreboding. That night, for the first time since my arrival, the constant thudding that had marked the rhythm of my nights was no longer heard. However, that absence was even more unsettling. As the darkness closed in around me, insomnia overcame me, driven by a force of pure curiosity. I decided to go up to the room above, despite something inside me warning me not to. I walked through the silent hallways, my footsteps echoing in the dim light. Upon reaching the door of the mysterious room, I knocked softly. There was no response. To my surprise, the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me to discover its secrets. With my heart pounding, I pushed the door and crossed the threshold. The moment I entered, I felt as if I had crossed into another world. The walls were covered in a red liquid, so thick and shiny that it looked like blood spilled in a macabre ritual. Perhaps my mind tried to protect me, forcing me not to pay full attention, or rather, to ignore the terrible reality unfolding before my eyes. But what froze my blood was the image that dominated the center of the room. There, sitting in an old and rickety chair, lay a corpse. The most disturbing thing was that, inexplicably, its organs were missing, as if the body had been stripped of its vital essence in a meticulous and brutal manner. For a moment, I felt as if my entire being had paralyzed. Terror and helplessness merged within me, while adrenaline surged through every fiber of my body. Unable to contain myself, I screamed. That scream, filled with horror and despair, propelled me to run without looking back, abandoning that nightmare without finding refuge in logic. My mind was filled with questions and doubts as I rushed down the stairs, leaving behind the chilling secret of the room. It didn't take long before the police arrived at the hotel. The investigations began immediately, and the pieces of the macabre puzzle seemed to point to the presence of a criminal whose shadow had loomed over Kleinwald for years. However, despite the efforts and the clues that emerged amidst the chaos, the authorities never managed to catch the person responsible for such an inhuman act. I, Sebastian, left the Oak Inn that same night, carrying with me the weight of an inexplicable horror and the certainty that, sometimes, the best-kept secrets hide behind the apparent tranquility of forgotten places. My escape from Berlin had ended in a nightmare, and although I tried to leave that experience behind, the echo of that cursed room and the image of the corpse without organs would continue to haunt me in every shadow and every silence. The small community of Kleinwald, with its rustic and enigmatic atmosphere, became the setting for a mystery that never found a solution. And I, forever marked by that night, learned that some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed. Next story. I remember my childhood in San Michele del Rive, a small village nestled in the Veneto region of Italy. Surrounded by green hills and wheat fields, our village seemed frozen in time. At the center of San Michele winds the River dell'Urlo, named for the murmurs that, according to the elders, rose from its waters on moonless nights. That river witnessed our mischief and laughter, but it also held a secret that would mark my soul forever. From a very young age, I had a friend whom, out of respect for what would happen later, I prefer not to name. He and I were inseparable. Together, we roamed the dirt paths, ran barefoot through the meadows, and spent hours playing by the banks of the River dell'Urlo. Despite the laughter and camaraderie we shared, I always sensed a shadow in him, a mix of innocence and cruelty that I couldn't quite understand. One summer afternoon, as the sun turned the fields golden, we decided to explore near the river. Among the stones and grass, we found a small lizard. The excitement of the discovery overwhelmed us, and without thinking, we caught it. I was fascinated by the creature, but my friend's face took on a different expression, one that would soon become unforgettable. With the lizard in his hand, he held it firmly and, in a voice that wavered between mockery and seriousness, asked me, "How long do you think it'll last before it drowns?" Before I could react, he grabbed an old metal bucket that had been forgotten near some barrels, filled it with fresh water, and, without further ado, submerged the little lizard. He did it not once, not twice, but 3 times in a row. Each submersion was meticulous, as if he were measuring something more than just how long the creature could survive underwater. Alarmed and with my heart pounding, I said to him seriously, "Let the lizard go. This isn't a game." He looked at me with a mix of confusion and cold indifference, and after a few seconds that felt like an eternity, he released it. Immediately, he burst into a laugh that chilled the air, a laugh that echoed inside me and left an indelible mark. Things like that happened often during our endless days of play. Even though I trusted him completely back then, that afternoon by the River dell'Urlo began to sow unease in my heart. How could tenderness and cruelty coexist in the same person? As the river's water continued to flow gently and the echoes of our childhood mingled with the murmur of the currents, I realized that in San Michele del Rive, amid the beauty of the landscape and the apparent innocence of our games, there were shadows capable of turning even the fondest memories into omens of terror. The days following that afternoon by the River dell'Urlo became even more unsettling. While I tried to make sense of my friend's strange duality, grim news spread through the village. Some dogs and cats had been found dead in the area, their bodies brutally stabbed and strangled. The inexplicable violence in these acts couldn't be a coincidence. I'm not foolish. Deep down, I began to suspect that the same coldness he had shown by the river might be connected to these horrific events. Cautiously, I decided to talk to him. When we seemed to be alone, I discreetly approached him and asked, my voice trembling with fear and confusion, "Do you know anything about what's happening?" His gaze grew intense, and with a calmness that chilled my blood, he replied, "I don't know anything." Though his words sounded convincing, my heart wouldn't stop racing. Something about his response felt unsettlingly familiar, and I couldn't shake the feeling that a dark secret lurked within him. That same afternoon, seeking to escape the tension hanging over the village, my friend and I went to an old pier by the river. There, under the pale light of dusk, we sat in silence, letting the water carry away our worries as we threw stones into the void. The sound of the rocks hitting the water broke the silence but couldn't dispel the cold that had taken hold of me. After a few moments of stillness, my friend, his gaze lost on the horizon, unexpectedly broke the silence. In a low, almost whispered voice, he began to speak about life. Life, he said, pausing as if searching for the right words, is like this river. It flows uncontrollably, dragging us mercilessly. We're just leaves carried by a dark current, destined to drown in the abyss of fate, without the chance to choose who we'll be or what suffering we'll endure. His words, filled with terrifying melancholy, sank into me. I didn't know how to respond or what to think of such a disturbing reflection. I just sat in silence, watching the stones disappear into the water as darkness seemed to envelop everything. That night, as the evening breeze carried the echoes of violence and uncertainty, I realized that the innocence of our childhood games had only been the surface of something much deeper and more disturbing. In the silence of the pier and the rhythm of the river Dellerlo, secrets were hidden that threatened to reveal a truth perhaps better left concealed. The next day, the atmosphere in San Michel del Rive turned irreparably somber. The entire village had gathered at my friend's old house. Whispers spread from mouth to mouth. Someone had killed his father. I didn't see the body, but the descriptions from those who did said it looked like a scene straight out of hell, too gruesome to be real. When the police arrived, they took the body away, leaving us all in a stunned and disconcerting silence. The following days were a spiral of unease and anguish. The police, along with the neighbors, searched for my friend, but he had disappeared without a trace. Rumors spread that the killer, or perhaps the same force that had taken his father's life, had taken him too. That uncertainty grew more bitter with each passing day, and the weight of what had happened began to deeply mark my existence. Years passed, and life went on in San Michel, though the shadow of that event never fully dissipated. 18 years later, a colleague who worked in the police contacted me and told me something that chilled my blood. According to him, my friend's life hadn't been as happy or peaceful as I had believed. I won't go into detail about what happened in his house back then. For what occurred, there was a torment so dark that no one should ever have experienced it. The presences, the silent screams in the night, and a series of inexplicable events marked his existence in a way that I still find hard to comprehend. With a heavy heart, I hold on to the hope that, wherever my friend is, or if he's still alive, he has found a way out of the darkness that enveloped him since that fateful day. But deep down, something tells me that the shadow of that past may have trapped him forever, condemning him to wander in a limbo of suffering and broken memories. Every time I walk by the banks of the river Dellerlo or hear the murmur of the wind through the alleys of our village, I feel the presence of that childhood marked by innocence and cruelty, and the echo of a friendship that faded into the shadows. San Michel del Rive remains a silent witness to what was and to what, perhaps, can never be forgotten. Next story. It was the year 1987, and I was just a child living in a small village in Slovakia called Mala Luka. This place, hidden among rolling hills and dense forests, seemed frozen in time. Its cobblestone streets, the worn facades of the houses, and the sense of damp earth made me feel as if I had stepped into a world of its own, where the past mingled with the present in every corner. In Mala Luka, there was a legend that sent chills down the spine of anyone who heard it. Parents, with trembling voices and furtive glances, told the story of the child snatcher. They said it was an elongated being, a shadow without a defined form, always lurking around every corner. According to the tales, if you found yourself on the streets at dusk, it would catch you and take you into the thick forest, from which no one ever returned. I remember clearly the nights when my mother would hold me tightly and warn me, "Never go out alone after dark, son. The child snatcher roams and shows no mercy to the careless." I, caught between the innocence of my childhood and the curiosity that drove me to uncover every secret of the village, sometimes wondered if all of that was just the product of an overactive imagination or perhaps a way to keep children safe. However, there was something in those stories that deeply unsettled me, a chill that ran down my spine every time I heard the echo of my own footsteps in the dark street. Twilight slowly spread over Mala Luka, painting the sky in shades of orange and red as I ventured out to play near the central square. That square, with its old stone fountain and worn benches, was the only place in the village where children gathered without fear, at least until the shadows began to dominate the horizon. In those moments, the atmosphere changed, the air grew heavier, and the murmur of the wind seemed to carry unintelligible words, like ancient warnings. One afternoon, while playing near the edge of the forest, I heard for the first time what seemed like the cracking of distant branches, accompanied by a whisper I couldn't identify. I looked around, trying to discern if it was my imagination or something real, and it was then that I felt, almost like a cold brush, the presence of something or someone following me from a distance. My heart raced and my feet stopped dead in their tracks. Could it be the child snatcher emerging from the shadows? That question etched itself into my young mind, caught between confusion and fear. From that moment on, every shadow seemed to hide a secret, and every whisper of the wind resonated like a sinister echo of the legend. Although many said it was just stories to keep children indoors, I knew, with an inexplicable certainty, that what I had witnessed was not human. Something moved at the edge of the forest, something that defied logic and the tranquility of our small village. That night, as I lay in bed with my head full of worries, the distant sounds of nature mixed with the rapid beating of my heart. Without fully understanding it, I knew that my life in Malaluka was about to change, that the dark secrets and the presence of that elongated being would indelibly mark my destiny. I don't know why, but that night I woke up, I think it was around 4 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, and I lay there thinking about the future, about what I would do with my life. A strange thought for a child, but the unease wouldn't subside. As my mind wandered through those big questions for my short existence, something unexpected happened. Someone knocked on the door. At first, I felt paralyzed. My heart pounded, and the darkness seemed to hide even darker secrets. With a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to go downstairs, though I didn't open the door right away. My instinct urged me to investigate without rushing, so I approached the window to see who was outside. What I saw froze my blood. There, standing on the threshold, was a strange man. He wore an enormous coat that almost completely covered him, and on his back, a hunch distorted his figure. He didn't say a word, he just stood there in silence, staring at me intently for what felt like an eternity. His piercing gaze fixed on me, as if he wanted to read my darkest thoughts. After what felt like an endless moment, the man disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind an inexplicable sense of terror. I didn't understand what his presence meant, but something in me sensed that it was connected to the legend of the child snatcher, that elongated shadow the adults spoke of so often. The next morning, the village woke up enveloped in a disturbing silence. Rumors spread, and with a mix of fear and confusion, everyone knew something had happened. A child from the village had disappeared. No one knew what had occurred, but the whispers and worried glances said it all. The adults recalled the warnings about the sinister presence in the streets, and deep down, everyone feared that the legend might be more real than they had ever imagined. I, still haunted by the vivid memory of the man in the coat with the hunchback, was torn between awe and terror. The disappearance of the child, combined with what I had witnessed that night, seemed to confirm that this was no figment of the imagination. Something dark and malevolent lurked in our small village of Malaluka, and I was now a witness to a mystery that delved into the inexplicable. That early morning and the disappearance at dawn left an indelible mark on me. With each passing day, the shadow of the child snatcher became more tangible, and a sense of insecurity took hold of the streets and the souls of those who lived in that place. As the rumors spread and the authorities tried to unravel the mystery, I understood that my childhood had changed forever, marked by the presence of the inexplicable and the constant question of whether there truly were beings hiding behind every shadow. The day after that fateful morning, the atmosphere in Malaluka grew even more oppressive. One of our neighbors, Mr. Merrick, committed suicide. The news spread like a cold wind through the narrow streets of the village. The police arrived immediately to investigate, and that same afternoon, the unimaginable was revealed. Merrick had kidnapped the missing child, as in a drawer of his humble home, they found the child's teeth. The weight of that revelation shattered what little innocence remained in our village. The adults whispered in low voices, unable to comprehend how someone they thought they knew so well could harbor such deep evil. For me, just a child, reality became a labyrinth of fear and confusion, where the legends they told so often seemed to materialize into horrifying acts. Despair spread through every corner of Malaluka. Were the stories about the child snatcher not just tales to scare us? Now, the macabre evidence pointed to the fact that darkness could dwell in the human heart, disguised as just another neighbor. That revelation left an indelible scar on my soul, a reminder that the line between legend and reality can be dangerously thin. 2 days later, when the echoes of that tragedy still resonated in the streets and in our hearts, a new event tore through the already fragile calm of the night. As I tried to sleep, an unexpected noise woke me. Someone was knocking on the door. The sound, insistent and metallic, seemed to come from another world, and my heart shuddered with an inexplicable terror. With my soul filled with unease, I got up silently and approached the door. Who dared to disturb the stillness of a night already tainted by sorrow and mystery? In that moment, I remembered the figure of that strange man in the enormous coat with the hunchback, and I couldn't help but feel that the shadows of the past were stalking me once more. I never found out who was on the other side of that door. The sound ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving me with a sense of unease that seemed to announce that the evil had not disappeared but lingered, persistent, in every corner of our destiny. Today, as I recall those days of 1987, I realize that in Mala Luka, the darkness never fully went away. The tragedy and terror left an indelible mark on our village, and the legend of the child snatcher became a painful reality. Perhaps we will never understand why certain horrors hide behind the most familiar faces, or how despair can sow seeds of evil in human hearts. Within me, that night when someone knocked on the door again became an eternal reminder. Fear and desolation are part of life, and sometimes the true nightmare lies in the inability to find light amidst the darkness. Next story. My name is Henrik Mahler, and years ago, I managed a cattle farm in a small village in northern Germany called Hohenwested. It wasn't a particularly touristy or significant place on the map, but it was my home. The green hills, dense forests, and the mist that often settled over the fields gave the landscape a melancholic air. My farm, Hofmaler, was on the outskirts, near the edge of the Aukrug forest. There, I raised dairy cows and a few horses. It wasn't an easy life, but it was the one I knew. I liked the routine, waking up before dawn, checking the barn, feeding the animals, and repairing whatever needed fixing. But there was a time when something changed. Something dark settled in Hohenwested, and the tranquility I cherished turned into a prison of fear and suspicion. It all started with the animals. One cold November night, I found one of my best bulls, a strong and healthy stud, dead in the field. There were no signs of predators or illness. He was just there, stiff, with his eyes open and his mouth twisted in a strange grimace. I thought it might have been a heart attack or some accidental poisoning, but when I examined his body, I noticed something else. Precise cuts on his abdomen, as if someone had opened him with a knife and then sewn him back up. That same week, 2 more animals died in similar ways. I couldn't explain it. Neither could the local veterinarians. Some of my neighbors said it was wolves, though we had never seen any in the area. Others spoke of Die Alti, an old local story about a woman who, centuries ago, had been executed in the forest for practicing witchcraft. According to the legend, her spirit still roamed the area, bringing misfortune to farmers. I didn't believe in such things. But then, something even stranger happened. One night, as I finished checking the barn, I saw something in the forest. Small lights flickered among the trees, floating as if they were lanterns suspended in the air. At first, I thought they were poachers, so I grabbed my flashlight and shotgun and approached. But when I reached the edge of the forest, the lights disappeared. There were no sounds of footsteps or movement among the leaves, just a heavy silence that made me feel watched. Something wasn't right. When I returned to the house, I found the barn door wide open. I was sure I had closed it. I entered with my gun raised, expecting to find a thief. But what I saw left me frozen. The cows were huddled in a corner, restless and mooing nervously. And on the dirt floor, there were footprints, but not human or animal. They were elongated as if someone had walked barefoot, but with toes that were too long and sharp. That night I barely slept. Something was on my farm, something I couldn't explain. And the worst was yet to come. The terror intensified in the following days. Every morning, I woke up with the feeling that something was wrong, as if the darkness creeping into the corners of my farm had taken on a life of its own. The village's quietness had become oppressive, and in Hohenwested, everyone seemed to carry a secret they preferred not to share. One early morning, while the mist still enveloped the fields, I decided to investigate the strange footprints I had found the previous night. I walked to the edge of the Okrug forest, following a path that was usually quiet and familiar. But that morning, each step took me deeper into an unnatural silence, broken only by the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. I reached a clearing where I noticed marks similar to those I had seen in the barn, long footprints, with exaggeratedly long toes and a shape that defied any natural explanation. In the center of the clearing, as if someone had recently been there, was a small circle of stones. They seemed intentionally placed, like an ancient ritual forgotten by time. My heart raced as the cold breeze brushed the back of my neck, and for a moment, I swore I heard a distant whisper repeating my name. I returned to the farm without answers, but with the unease of having witnessed something that defied logic. That feeling intensified with the appearance of inexplicable phenomena at night. One moonless night, as I tried to fall asleep, I was awakened by a persistent murmur that seemed to come from outside. With my flashlight in hand and fear echoing in my ears, I decided to investigate. The sound led me to the village's small cemetery, a place filled with old, neglected graves that told stories of times past. Among the tombstones, the figure of a woman dressed in ancient clothing became visible. Her gait was slow and almost ethereal, and though her face was in shadows, I could perceive bright, desperate eyes. I remembered the legend of Dai Alti, the woman accused of witchcraft who, it was said, had cursed the village before her execution. The figure vanished as quickly as she appeared, leaving behind a silence heavy with warning. I decided to approach the grave that, according to legend, belonged to that mysterious figure. The tombstone, eroded by time, bore almost illegible inscriptions. As I examined it, I felt the ground tremble slightly beneath my feet, and an intense cold enveloped me. It wasn't the cold of the night, but something that seemed to come from the depths of death itself. As the days passed, the phenomena intensified. The farm animals seemed hypnotized, moving in strange patterns and staring fixedly toward the forest as if waiting for something. The flickering lights in the thicket became a nightly presence, and the footprints reappeared in different parts of the farm. One night, unable to bear the unease, I decided to watch the barn. I settled in a dark corner, observing through the small window as the gloom seemed to come alive. It was then that I heard slow, dragging footsteps. They weren't from any known animal, and in the darkness, the sound seemed to multiply, enveloping me in a sense of imminent danger. When I peered out, I saw shadows moving erratically. One figure, in particular, stood out, a hunched silhouette slowly approaching the threshold. I couldn't make out its features, but its presence was unmistakable. My trembling hands gripped the shotgun, and a muffled cry escaped my lips. The figure stopped just a few meters away, and in a blink, it vanished into the darkness, leaving behind an echo of despair and an air thick with death. Fear took hold of me. That night, I slept little, haunted by nightmares where the face of the woman from the cemetery stared at me with a mix of sadness and fury. Every whisper of the wind seemed to repeat her curse, and every shadow turned into a specter of the past. With my mind full of questions and my soul torn by terror, I knew that something ancient and dark had awakened on my farm and in Hohenwested. The legend of Dai Alti wasn't just a tale to scare children. It was the manifestation of a force that now seemed hungry for vengeance. After weeks of relentless terror, I knew I had to confront what had plagued my life in Hohenwested. The unease that gripped me led me, one stormy night, to the clearing in the Okrug forest, where the enigmatic circle of stones I had seen during my initial investigations was located. With my heart in my hand and determination forged in fear, I crossed the underbrush guided by the flickering light of my flashlight. When I arrived, I noticed that the stones seemed to emit a faint glow, as if they wanted to communicate something to me. In the center of the circle, a larger stone bore inscriptions worn by time, written in an archaic language that, somehow, resonated deep within my soul. I then remembered the old village legends, the story of Dai Alti, the woman accused of witchcraft and cursed, whose spirit cried out for redemption. I understood that to appease this dark force, I had to perform a ritual, an offering that would seal the fate of the evil looming over my farm. I returned to my old cabin and, among my belongings, found a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations. That object, laden with history and memories, became my offering. I returned to the clearing and, with trembling hands, placed the medallion in the center of the circle. At that moment, the silence turned into an almost imperceptible murmur that seemed to emanate from every corner of the forest. The air filled with an ancient energy, and slowly, the silhouette of a woman emerged from the mist. It was Dialti. Her figure, half in profile and enveloped in a mix of light and shadow, appeared before me with a sad and profound gaze. In a calm voice filled with melancholy, she explained that she had been unjustly condemned, that her spirit had been chained to this place for centuries, and that the curse plaguing the village was the result of ancient sins and mistakes that needed to be atoned for. The price of redemption, she said, was the acceptance of collective guilt and the commitment to right the wrongs of the past. With my soul oppressed but filled with a determination born of fear and compassion, I recited in a low voice the prayers that the wind seemed to whisper among the branches. Each word, laden with ancestral pain, seemed to break the rigidity of the atmosphere. Meanwhile, the spectral figure slowly faded, dissolving into the mist, leaving behind a silence filled with peace and promises of renewal. By dawn, the storm had dissipated, and an unexpected calm had taken over the place. I returned to my farm and noticed that the animals, once restless and disturbed, were behaving normally again. The village, though still marked by the memories of the strange events, began to regain the peace and routine that had always characterized Hohenwested. Today, as I write these lines, I feel the indelible mark of that decisive night within me. The curse of Dialti has dissipated, and though the echo of her sadness and fury still reverberates in some corners of my memory, the weight of darkness has given way to a faint light of hope. I have learned that sometimes it is necessary to delve into the darkness to understand and heal the wounds of the past. This experience marked me for life, reminding me that courage and faith can transform even the most terrifying of shadows into an opportunity to redeem the inhuman and the forgotten.